The last photograph slid into the box, a ghost of his wife's smile, disappearing into the cardboard dusk. Elias Thorne folded the flaps, one over the other, entombing 30 years of a life that no longer felt like his own. Outside, the wind moaned through the pines, a low, mournful sound that had become the only voice he tolerated. Each object he packed away, the porcelain teacup she'd loved, the worn copy of a book she'd read to him, was a severing. He was cutting the final threads, preparing for the quiet emptiness he believed he deserved. That was when he heard it, a faint scratching at the cabin door. Not the frantic scrabble of a squirrel or the heavy paw of a bear, but something deliberate, rhythmic, insistent. He ignored it. The mountains were full of noises, illusions born of solitude and wind. But it came again, scratch, pause, scratch. A demand. With a sigh that carried the weight of a decade, Elias rose from the dusty floor, his joints protesting. He unlatched the heavy oak door and pulled it open just enough to peer out. A pair of amber eyes, ancient and intelligent, met his gaze. It was a dog, or something close to it, a rangy, wolf-like creature with a coat the color of twilight shadows. One of its front legs was mangled, held awkwardly off the ground, and a dark stain matted the fur along its flank. Yet, it did not cower or snarl. It simply stood there on 3 legs, watching him, its breath pluming in the frigid air. It had come to his door not for refuge from the brewing storm, but with the bearing of a messenger arriving for a long-overdue appointment. Elias tried to close the door. "Go on, get," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. The dog didn't move. It lowered its head slightly and nudged the door with its nose, a gesture of profound, unyielding patience. Something in its gaze held him captive, a flicker of shared pain, of a wound deeper than the flesh. Against every instinct that screamed for isolation, Elias opened the door wider. The animal limped inside, not with the gratitude of a stray finding shelter, but with the quiet purpose of a guide who had finally reached his charge. The storm broke with the fury of a shattered memory, rattling the cabin's single window pane. Inside, the silence was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of the dog's breathing. Elias had cleaned the wound as best he could, his old medic training returning to his hands like a forgotten prayer. The gash was deep, but clean. The dog had endured his touch with a stoicism that shamed him, its amber eyes never leaving his face. He'd offered it water, which it took, and a piece of jerky, which it ignored. It lay now on the rag rug before the hearth, not asleep, but watchful. Elias sat in his worn armchair, the half-packed box of his past life accusing him from the floor. He felt a strange unease, a disruption to the meticulously constructed emptiness he had cultivated. He decided to call the dog Shadow, for it seemed to have materialized from the dark edges of the world, a living embodiment of the things he'd tried to outrun. When dawn finally fractured the darkness, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, the storm had passed. The world outside was washed clean, glistening under a fragile sun. Shadow rose, its movements stiff, and limped to the door. It nudged the wood, then looked back at Elias. The message was unmistakable. "Your charity ends here," Elias grumbled, opening the door. "Go on now," but Shadow didn't leave. It moved a few paces out onto the damp earth, into the scent of pine and wet soil, and waited. When Elias remained in the doorway, the dog let out a soft whine, a sound not of pleading but of impatience. It took a few more limping steps toward the dense, untracked forest that bordered his property, then stopped again, its gaze locking with his. It was not asking for freedom. It was an invitation, an order. A strange, illogical certainty began to form in Elias's mind. This was not a random encounter. He looked from the dog to the box of his wife's memories, to the sterile quiet of the cabin he had turned into a tomb. There was nothing for him here but the slow, grinding erosion of time. With a resolve he hadn't felt in years, he turned back inside. He left the box on the floor. He pulled on his worn hiking boots, grabbed his old service rucksack, and packed a canteen, the last of the jerky, and a compass he hadn't touched since his discharge. He walked out, closing the door on the ghost of his life, and followed the 3-legged dog into the woods. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of slick roots, and Hidden Hollow's Shadow moved with a steady, 3-legged rhythm, a painful but determined gait that set their pace. It was a slow, meditative journey that forced Elias out of the frantic rush of his own thoughts. For years, his mind had been a battlefield, replaying the same firefights, the same losses, the same final, bitter argument with his son, Michael. The words, hurled like stones, echoed in the stillness between the trees. "You're not even here anymore, Dad. You're just a ghost in a uniform." He winced, stumbling on a loose rock. Shadow paused, looking back, its amber eyes seeming to pierce through the veil of his memory. The dog didn't offer comfort, only a steady, silent presence that said, "Keep moving." The further they went, the more the forest seemed to peel back the layers of his armor. The scent of damp earth reminded him of monsoon season overseas. The snap of a twig sounded like a distant rifle crack. He saw the faces of fallen comrades in the gnarled bark of ancient oaks. He had come to these mountains seeking silence, but he had only found a place where his ghosts could scream louder. He remembered his wife, Sarah, in her final months. The way she'd look at him, her eyes filled not with pity, but with a profound sorrow for the man who had come home from the war in body, but not in spirit. He had been a fortress of solitude, and she had spent years trying to find a way in, only to finally grow weary of the siege. The dog stopped beside a small, clear spring bubbling up from a bed of moss-covered stones. It drank deeply, then waited for Elias. As he knelt to refill his canteen, he saw his reflection in the water. The face that stared back was a stranger's, gaunt, hollow-eyed, etched with a map of sorrows he could no longer name. He was Michael's ghost. He was Sarah's sorrow. He was the sum of his failures. Shadow nudged his hand, its wet nose a startling point of contact in his desolate world. He looked from his reflection to the dog. The animal's leg was a permanent injury, a visible manifestation of its past trauma. Yet, it moved forward. It led. It had a purpose. For the first time, Elias felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was a question. Where were they going? A sky the color of slate opened up without warning, unleashing a torrential downpour. The gentle creek they had been following swelled into a churning, brown torrent, erasing their path. The log bridge Elias had hoped to use was now submerged, bucking in the violent current. It was an impassable barrier. A sign. "This is it," he said aloud, his voice swallowed by the roar of the water. "This is as far as we go." It was a relief. He could turn back, return to the numb safety of his cabin, and sink back into the quiet decay he had chosen. He was old, tired, and chasing a phantom led by a wounded dog. It was madness. He turned to go, but Shadow stood its ground. It stared at the raging water, then began to move upstream, its limp more pronounced on the slick, muddy bank. It ignored Elias's call, its focus absolute. He watched it disappear around a bend, a small, determined speck of gray against the fury of the storm. Resignation settled over him. He would wait a few minutes, and when the dog didn't return, he would go back alone. It was for the best. But minutes later, Shadow reappeared. It stood beside a massive, fallen sequoia that spanned the chasm, its trunk slick with rain and moss. It was a treacherous crossing, a bridge for younger, surer feet. The dog barked once, a sharp, commanding sound. It then carefully, deliberately, picked its way across the log, its claws finding purchase in the rough bark. Upon reaching the other side, it turned and waited, a sentinel silhouetted against the storm. Elias stared at the log, then at the dog. His knee, where he'd taken shrapnel decades ago, throbbed in the cold rain. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct for self-preservation told him to stay put. But as he watched Shadow stand its ground, refusing to abandon him, a different instinct took over. It was the soldier's creed, buried under years of rust and regret. You do not leave anyone behind. Not even a three-legged dog. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the log. With his eyes fixed on Shadow, he shuffled across, his boots slipping, the water roaring beneath him. When his foot finally touched solid ground, a wave of adrenaline and exhaustion washed over him. He sank to his knees beside the dog, his entire body trembling. Shadow leaned against him, a warm, solid weight in the cold rain. Elias reached into his pack, pulled out the last piece of jerky, and split it in two. As they shared the meager meal, a silent understanding passed between them. They were no longer man and animal. They were survivors. Comrades. They walked for another day, the terrain growing steeper, the forest thicker. Elias moved on autopilot, fueled by a strange sense of inevitability. He had surrendered his will to the small, limping creature ahead of him. Then, as the sun began its descent, casting long, golden shafts of light through the canopy, Shadow stopped. They stood at the edge of a small, hidden meadow, a pocket of impossible tranquility carved into the mountainside. And there, nestled against a sheer rock face, almost consumed by ivy and time, was a cabin. It was smaller than his own, built of dark, weathered logs, with a stone chimney from which a faint, ghostly wisp of smoke curled into the evening air. Shadow didn't hesitate. It limped across the meadow, its tail giving a single, low wag. It went straight to the simple plank door and scratched it, just as it had scratched at Elias's door what felt like a lifetime ago. Elias followed, his senses on high alert. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant someone was here, or had been, very recently. His hand instinctively went to the hunting knife on his belt. Who lived this far out, this disconnected from the world? Was it a friend or a foe? He braced himself as the dog nudged the door. It swung inward with a low groan, not latched. The air that drifted out was cool and smelled of wood smoke, pine needles, and something else, something like peace. Shadow entered without fear. Elias peered into the gloom. The cabin was empty. A low fire whispered in the stone hearth, its embers glowing like sleeping eyes. It was as if the owner had just stepped out for a moment. A simple cot was neatly made in the corner. A collection of hand-carved birds sat on the mantelpiece. On a small, sturdy table in the center of the room, a leather-bound journal lay open next to a single, silver-framed photograph. Elias stepped across the threshold, a feeling of profound reverence settling over him. He was not an intruder here. He was a guest. Elias moved deeper into the cabin, drawn by an invisible current. The place felt sacred, a sanctuary preserved from the ravages of the outside world. His gaze fell upon the photograph on the table. It showed a young man with kind eyes and a reserved smile, his arm draped around a magnificent wolf dog. The dog was the spitting image of Shadow, but it was whole, strong, standing proudly on four legs. Elias's heart constricted. He picked up the frame, his thumb tracing the outline of the young man's face. He knew him. The recognition was a jolt, a memory dredged up from the muddy depths of the past. Arthur Vance, the quiet medic from his unit. The kid they'd all called Doc. He'd been barely 20, always reading a book, with a gentleness that had seemed out of place in the chaos of war. Elias had hardly spoken to him, just another face in a platoon of ghosts. He set the photo down and turned his attention to the journal. The handwriting was neat, precise, the script of a thoughtful man. He read the first entry, dated 5 years prior. I have come to the end of the world to see if I can find the beginning of myself. The money is a cancer. It has bought me everything and given me nothing. Here, perhaps, I can build something that matters. Elias sank into the simple wooden chair, his eyes scanning page after page. Arthur's story unfolded. After the war, he'd used his medical knowledge to help develop a revolutionary piece of surgical technology. The invention had made him extraordinarily wealthy, a titan of industry. But the fortune had only amplified his emptiness, his unresolved trauma from the war. He wrote of his guilt, a burden that had grown heavier with each passing year. He wrote of a specific day, a firefight in a rain-soaked jungle village, an impossible choice made under fire. A choice that had saved some, but cost others. A choice Elias had been a part of. The memory flooded back, sharp and brutal. The chaotic orders, the screaming, the face of a young soldier they had been forced to leave behind. Elias had buried that day deep, but Arthur had carried it every day. The journal's final pages were written in a shakier hand. Arthur wrote of his failing health and of his one loyal companion, Ghost, the dog in the photograph. He is all that is good in this world, Arthur had written. He knows my heart. When my time comes, he will know what to do. He will find the right person. The last entry was a map, a simple sketch of the cabin's hearth. Beneath it were the words, "Everything I have is here." It is not a treasure, but a tool. For atonement. Find it. Use it to mend what we broke. A cold dread mixed with a disbelieving awe settled over Elias. Mend what we broke. The words echoed the deepest shame of his soul. He looked at Shadow, at Ghost, now curled by the dying fire, watching him with those same knowing eyes. The dog had not led him to a random place. It had fulfilled its master's final wish. It had brought him here. Hesitantly, Elias approached the hearth. The stones were old and soot-stained, set with a craftsman's care. He ran his hands over them, searching for a loose one, a seam, anything that matched the diagram in the journal. He found it near the base, a single stone that shifted slightly under pressure. Using the tip of his knife, he pried it loose. Behind it was a small, hollow space, and within that, a recessed iron ring. He pulled. A section of the hearthstone, heavy and solid, lifted like a lid, revealing a dark, metal-lined cavity beneath. Inside, meticulously wrapped in oilcloth and bound with leather straps, were dozens of neat, rectangular packages. His hands trembled as he lifted one out. He unwrapped the cloth. Staring back at him were stacks of bearer bonds, crisp and official, each with a staggering denomination. He unwrapped another, and another. They filled the box. A quick calculation in his head sent a wave of vertigo through him. It was an astronomical sum. The journal hadn't exaggerated. $157 million. The sheer physical reality of it, the weight of it in his hands, was overwhelming. It was a king's ransom. It was freedom. It was a new life, a world away from the ghosts and the grief. He could disappear, buy an island, live in absolute comfort and silence, insulated from every painful memory. He thought of his son. He could find Michael wherever he was. He could lay this fortune at his feet. An apology made of gold. Surely, this could mend anything. He could buy back the lost years, buy his son's forgiveness, buy his way back into a life he had forfeited. The temptation was a living thing in the silent cabin, whispering of escape, of power, of a final, glorious erasure of his past. He looked at the stacks of paper that represented more money than he could possibly comprehend, and for a terrifying moment, he saw it not as a tool for atonement, but as his own personal salvation. The night deepened, pressing in on the small cabin. Elias didn't light a lamp. He sat in the darkness, the open strongbox at his feet a gaping maw of possibility. The fire had died to embers, and the only light came from the moon, a sliver of silver that did little to pierce the gloom. The fortune was a poison. He could feel it seeping into him, twisting his thoughts. The idea of using it for himself had taken root, a dark and seductive weed. He would be powerful, respected. He would never be weak or haunted again. He would build a new fortress, not of solitude, but of wealth, and this time, nothing would ever touch him. He pictured Michael's face, not with love, but with a vindictive sort of triumph. He would show his son what he had become. He would prove him wrong. The thought left a bitter, ashen taste in his mouth. Is that who he was? A man who would use this incredible gift, this burden of atonement, to settle a score born of his own failings? He glanced at Ghost. The dog had not moved. It lay with its head on its paws, its eyes open, fixed on him. In their amber depths, he saw no judgment, only a deep, abiding sorrow. It was the same sorrow he had seen in his wife's eyes. A sorrow for the man he was supposed to be, the man Arthur Vance had believed he could be. He picked up the journal again, his fingers finding the last page. Use it to mend what we broke. It was not about them. It was not about their personal pain or their individual salvation. It was about the young soldier they had left behind. It was about all the soldiers, the ones who came home and the ones who didn't, the ones who carried the invisible wounds that never healed. It was about the families they shattered, the sons they drove away, the wives whose love they couldn't accept because they didn't believe they deserved it. The money wasn't an escape route. It was a bridge, a way back, not for him alone, but for all of them. The fight within him raged until the first hint of dawn. He paced the small floor, from the cold hearth to the lonely cot, a prisoner between greed and grace. Finally, exhausted, he stopped in the center of the room. The moon had set, and the world was suspended in the gray hush before sunrise. He looked at Arthur's photograph, at the quiet medic's gentle smile. He had died with this hope, this faith that his life's work would fall into the right hands. He had trusted a dog to carry that hope into the world. As the sun crested the mountains, flooding the small valley with clean, new light, a profound calm settled over Elias. The battle was over. He knew what he had to do. The choice felt less like a decision and more like a surrender, a release. He knelt and began to carefully repackage the bonds, his movements deliberate and reverent. Each bundle he placed back in the strongbox was a weight lifted from his own soul. He was not rejecting a fortune. He was accepting a purpose. He closed the heavy stone lid, the sound echoing in the stillness of the cabin like a gavel marking a final judgment. The secret was safe once more. He would take only two things: Arthur's journal and the photograph of the man and his dog. They were the true treasures. He filled his canteen, packed the last of his supplies, and stood at the door. Ghost was already there, waiting, as if he had known all along what the outcome would be. Elias reached down and laid a hand on the dog's head. "Thank you, Arthur," he whispered to the empty room. Then he stepped outside. The journey back was different. The forest that had seemed so menacing on the way and now felt vibrant and alive. The gash in the earth carved by the raging creek was now just a stream, chuckling over smooth stones. He noticed the startling blue of a jay's feather on the path, the intricate patterns of moss on a fallen tree, the way the light filtered through the leaves. The world had not changed, but he had. The ghosts in his mind were still there, but they were quieter now, their voices fading from screams to whispers. He was no longer running from them. He was walking with them, carrying their stories toward a place of healing. When they finally emerged from the tree line and he saw his own small cabin in the distance, it didn't look like a tomb anymore. It looked like a starting point. Ghost limped faithfully at his side, no longer a guide to a hidden place, but a companion for the road ahead. Within a month, the quiet world of Elias Thorne was transformed. He found a small-town lawyer, a man with honest eyes, and together they navigated the complex legal channels to honor Arthur Vance's last wish. The Arthur Vance Foundation was born, endowed with the entirety of the $157 million fortune. Its mission was simple and profound: to build and support healing communities for veterans and their families, places where the invisible wounds of war could be tended with compassion and understanding, where purpose could be rediscovered not in isolation, but in service. Elias sought no credit. The foundation was in Arthur's name, its story attributed to an anonymous benefactor. But news of such a staggering act of charity, rooted in the quiet mountains, inevitably trickled out. A local journalist wrote a simple, dignified piece about a reclusive veteran and his three-legged dog, a story not of found money, but of found purpose. Elias was reading that story on his porch one crisp autumn afternoon when a car he didn't recognize rumbled up his long, gravel driveway. He stood, his heart suddenly beating a little faster, as a young man got out. It was Michael. He was older, his face carrying a new maturity, but his eyes were the same. They stood in silence for a long moment, the space between them filled with years of unspoken pain and regret. "I read the article," Michael said, his voice quiet. "A friend sent it to me." Elias simply nodded, unable to form words. "I didn't come for money, Dad," Michael continued, taking a hesitant step forward. I wanted to see the man who would do that." He looked past his father, toward the open cabin door. He was not looking at a ghost in a uniform. He was seeing his father, perhaps for the first time since the war. Elias stepped aside, holding the door open. It was an invitation. A homecoming. Ghost, whose leg had healed into a barely noticeable limp, rose from his spot by the fire and padded to the door, his tail giving a slow, welcoming wag. As his son crossed the threshold, Elias felt the last wall around his heart crumble to dust. The greatest treasure had not been hidden under a hearthstone in a remote cabin. It was here, in this moment of grace, a chance to mend what he himself had broken.